Imagine a quiet winter morning at a train station blanketed in falling snow. People come and go without noticing anything unusual until one German shepherd suddenly stops and stares at the bag of a 73-year-old woman. That simple moment unravels a chain of secrets, hidden technology, and a mystery that reaches deep into the human heart. Today we follow Officer Ethan and his incredible partner Ranger on a journey from suspicion to truth and from fear to compassion. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are watching from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories of courage, loyalty, and unexpected heroes, please support the channel by hitting subscribe so you never miss a new story. Winter came to Greystone like an old painter with a limited palette, laying down shades of gray and white over everything that refused to sleep. The train station sat in the heart of the city, a brick and glass relic from another era, its arched windows fogged by the breath of 100 strangers. Outside, snow fell in slow, patient flakes, drifting down between the steel ribs of the elevated tracks and gathering in soft ridges along the curbs. The air carried the metallic scent of cold rails and wet wool, mixed with roasted coffee from a kiosk that never seemed to close. Inside the main hall, the loudspeaker murmured about delayed departures. Luggage wheels rattled over tiled floors, and distant horns cried out from the tracks like tired giants calling through the mist. Ethan Reed moved through all of it with the practiced calm of a man who had walked this path 1,000 times, and yet still watched it as if it could change at any moment. Ethan was in his mid-30s, tall and solidly built, with the kind of shoulders that uniforms were made for. His dark brown hair was trimmed short, though a stubborn lock always seemed determined to fall forward near his right temple. A faint scar cut across his left eyebrow, not dramatic enough to be intimidating, but just visible enough to hint at nights he'd rather not talk about. His eyes were a thoughtful steel blue, the sort that didn't just look at people, but seemed to weigh what they carried inside. Ethan had the steady, grounded demeanor of someone who had made peace with responsibility early in life. Growing up, he had spent more time in hospital corridors than on playgrounds, sitting beside his grandmother as she recovered from one illness after another. Those years had carved patience into him, along with a habit of speaking gently to the elderly and listening more than he talked. He could be firm and decisive when danger was real, but with ordinary people he was careful, measured, almost protective. Walking a half step ahead of him, harness strapped snug across his chest, was Ranger. The German shepherd moved with a quiet confidence that drew glances without needing to ask for them. Ranger was 4 years old, in the prime of his working life, his coat a rich sable blend of black and tan that looked almost bronze where it caught the station lights. His ears stood high and alert, swiveling slightly with each new sound, while his amber eyes scanned the crowd with a focus that was neither nervous nor aggressive, just intensely aware. He had the strong, athletic frame of a dog bred for work, but there was a softness at the corners of his mouth when he looked at Ethan, a hint of warmth that belonged not to a tool, but to a partner. Before joining the K-9 unit, Ranger had been fostered by a family on the outskirts of Greystone, living in a small house with a backyard that backed onto a frozen creek. A car accident had taken the family's father, and life had changed. The family could no longer care for a high-energy working dog, and so Ranger had been transferred into the program, another creature redirected by loss. Perhaps that was why he and Ethan understood each other so well. Both had learned that duty could grow from the ruins of something that once hurt. That morning, they moved in sync along the platform edge, boots and paws making a soft rhythm against the floor. Ethan glanced at the digital clock overhead. 8:17 a.m. Rush hour was beginning to soften, the wave of commuters thinning into a scatter of late workers, students, and travelers with overstuffed lives packed into scuffed suitcases. Ranger's breathing was steady, his tail low but relaxed. He scanned, sniffed, adjusted his focus with that curious mix of instinct and training that made him so precious to the department. Ethan let his gaze sweep the station, a young couple arguing in hushed tones near the ticket machines, a businessman too busy with his phone to notice his coffee tipping dangerously, a teenager in a puffy blue jacket struggling with a guitar case. Nothing that set off alarms, just the usual mosaic of human busyness stitched together under winter light. Then Ranger stopped. It was not a dramatic freeze, not the stiff, tense halt of a dog about to bark. It was subtler than that. His paw hung for half a second before touching down again. His head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as he drank in a new scent. The leash tightened a fraction as Ethan felt the shift in him. "Easy, buddy," Ethan said softly, his voice low and calm, not wanting to project tension onto the dog or the crowd. Ranger didn't respond with a bark. Instead, he turned his head, eyes narrowing just a little, and began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward the far side of the platform waiting area. Ethan followed, muscles loosening rather than tensing, trusting the dog's instincts but refusing to jump ahead of what they actually knew. Ranger's pace was steady, not rushed, weaving between people with an almost human awareness of personal space. He ignored a lunch bag left too close to a bench, a backpack resting against someone's leg, a stroller with a toddler bundled up like a tiny snowman. Whatever had caught his attention was more specific, more focused. Ethan's heart rate ticked up a notch, not out of fear, but in a familiar readiness. K-9 officers lived in that narrow space between calm and alert, always prepared for the one moment when the world might change. Ranger stopped again, this time completely, his body aligned like an arrow pointing toward a row of seats near the broad station window, where snow pressed its white face against the glass. On the end of that row sat a woman, her hands folded over the handle of a well-worn tote bag resting at her feet. She was small and slightly hunched, wrapped in a dark wool coat that had been carefully mended at the cuffs. Wisps of silver hair curled from beneath a knitted hat, framing a face lined by years and softened by kindness. Her name was Margaret Hayes, 73 years old, retired librarian, a widow who still caught the same morning train each week to visit her younger sister on the other side of the city. Margaret had the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime shushing noisy readers and carefully stamping due dates into the back of borrowed stories. Her eyes, a faded hazel, tended to wander around new places with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She smiled easily, but any sign of raised voices or authority in uniform could still make her stomach knot, a leftover reflex from a humiliating incident years ago, when a younger officer had brusquely accused her of shoplifting before realizing the price tag had never been removed from a scarf she had bought. The apology had come, but the sting of being treated like a suspect had never quite faded. Today she had tried to ignore the flutter in her chest when she saw Ethan and Ranger on patrol earlier. She knew they were here to protect people like her. She knew logically that she had done nothing wrong. And yet, fear is rarely logical, especially in the elderly. It grows in the cracks where memories of past embarrassments and present frailty meet. Ranger stopped in front of her, not invading her space, just standing near enough that his attention was unmistakable, his head tilted, ears forward, eyes fixed, not on her face, but on the tote bag at her feet. He sniffed the air once, then again, drawing in whatever trace had called to him through the station's sea of smells. Ethan stepped up beside him, one hand light on the leash, the other resting near his utility belt, not out of threat, but habit. He studied the woman with that same measured gaze he'd shown 100 times, searching not just for danger, but for fear, confusion, or the signs of someone in trouble. He saw the tremor in her hands before she tried to hide it. "Good morning, ma'am," Ethan said, letting the warmth in his voice step forward before the badge did. "I'm Officer Ethan Reed with the Greystone Police Department. This is Ranger. I'm sorry to bother you, but he's showing interest in your bag, and I'm going to need to ask you a couple of questions, all right?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the bag handle. Her throat bobbed in a swallow. Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice thin but clear, like an old violin string still holding pitch. Ethan offered a small, reassuring smile. Up close, she reminded him of his grandmother, a similar way of sitting, as if always mindful not to take up too much space. "We're not saying anything is wrong yet," he replied. "Sometimes he picks up on scents that turn out to be nothing dangerous at all. But for everyone's safety, we do need to check. May I ask your name?" Margaret Hayes," she said, brushing a gloved hand nervously across her coat. "I was just waiting for the 10 o'clock train. I haven't done anything." Ethan nodded, already knowing this fear well. "I understand, Ms. Hayes. You're not in trouble. This is just routine when the dog indicates an item. Do you have a form of identification on you?" She fumbled for her purse, the movement awkward with cold, stiffened fingers and the subtle tremor of anxiety. Ranger remained steady, gaze dropping to the bag again, then lifting as if checking Ethan's reaction. The dog's body language was focused but not aggressive, tail neutral, posture forward but not rigid. It was the stance of a dog saying, "Something here is different, not someone here is dangerous." Ethan took the ID gently, glancing at it only long enough to confirm. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes," he said. "Everything checks out. Now, I do need to ask, did anyone handle your bag while you weren't looking? On your way here, or at the station?" Margaret blinked, thinking. I don't believe so," she said slowly. "I came from my apartment. The bus was crowded, but I kept it on my lap. At the coffee stand, I set it down for a moment when I reached for my wallet, but I had my hand on the strap the whole time. I'm quite careful, officer." "I can tell," Ethan replied. Her answer was coherent, consistent, and matched her demeanor. Not the scattered rambling of someone trying to hide something. They sounded more like the words of a woman desperate not to be misunderstood again. He could see the rising panic, the way her shoulders had climbed up toward her ears. To her, this wasn't just procedure. It was the echo of that day years ago, when a uniform had turned her into a spectacle. Ethan's voice softened further. "Ms. Hayes, I'm going to ask you to come with me to the security room just over there," he said, gesturing toward a nearby door with frosted glass panels. "We're going to run your bag through a more detailed check. You're welcome to walk beside me the whole time, and you'll be able to see exactly what we're doing. If everything is fine, you'll be right back in time to catch your train. And if everything is not fine," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Ethan held her gaze, steady as a lamppost in a snowstorm. "Then we'll deal with it," he answered honestly. "But based on what I see right now, the only thing I know for sure is that my dog smelled something interesting. That doesn't make you a criminal. It just means we have to follow the rules. Ranger's very good at his job, and I try not to embarrass innocent people while I'm doing mine." There was a faint flicker at the corner of her lips, halfway between a nervous twitch and the ghost of a smile. "I suppose I don't have much of a choice, do I?" "You always have a choice," Ethan said, then added, gently practical, "but this is the one that keeps everyone safest, including you." She nodded at last, hands still shaking, but her breathing beginning to slow. Carefully, she rose to her feet. Up close, her frailty was more apparent. The slight sway as she adjusted her weight, the way her knees seemed to argue with every motion. Ethan stepped back just enough to give her space, but not so far that she would feel alone. Ranger shifted to the side, creating a small corridor for her to move through, his eyes tracking the bag rather than her face. As they began walking toward the security room together, Margaret holding her bag a little tighter, Ethan walking at her pace, Ranger padding silently at his side. The snow outside thickened, pressing the world beyond the windows into a soft blur. Inside, the air seemed to hold its breath. For the people watching, it was a simple scene: an officer, his dog, and an older woman being led to a side room for a routine check. For Ethan, it was the beginning of a question he didn't yet know how to phrase. For Ranger, it was the first clear note of something wrong in the music of the morning. And for Margaret Hayes, it felt uncomfortably like stepping back into an old, unwelcome memory, though this time, she was not facing it alone. Snow continued to sift down outside the frosted station windows as Ethan escorted Margaret into the security examination room. The door shut with a muted click, sealing them into a calmer, quieter space. The room was clean, softly lit, with a long metal table, a standard luggage scanner, and 2 computer monitors glowing a pale blue. But this room, calm as it looked, was the place where stories changed. Ethan guided Margaret to a chair near the wall. She sat slowly, the kind of slow, cautious movement that came from stiff joints and long experience. Ranger lay down at Ethan's side, muscles taut but controlled, eyes still fixed on the bag at Margaret's feet, as though it whispered to him. A voice rose from the far corner. "I heard you had a hit." Stepping into view was Dylan Moore, the station's visiting micro-scanning technician. He was in his late 20s, slim, with light brown hair that fell slightly over his glasses, and a distracted yet quick intelligence in his hazel eyes. Dylan walked like someone whose mind tended to drift ahead of his feet. as if he was always thinking 2 sentences into the future. He wore jeans, a gray sweater, and a badge clipped awkwardly onto his belt. People sometimes mistook him for an intern or a student until they saw him work. Dylan had the rare gift of reading frequencies, wavelengths, and signals the way others read emotions. His background was unusual for law enforcement support. A childhood spent assembling radio kits with his father, followed by a scholarship in microelectronics and pattern detection. An accident in college, where a lab battery explosion left him partially deaf in one ear, had sharpened his fascination with the invisible world of signals and vibrations. He often joked that losing part of his physical hearing only made him more dedicated to listening to what humans couldn't. Ethan nodded at him. Ranger flagged the bag. Standard scanner didn't turn up anything. Which means, Dylan said, already pulling the tote bag onto the table, we're hunting ghosts in the spectrum again. He gave Margaret a quick, friendly smile, the kind that disarmed fear. No need to worry, Ms. Hayes. We're looking for things someone else may have put there, not something you did. Margaret nodded with gratitude, though her fingers still twisted slightly in her lap. Dylan started with the standard protocol. He ran the bag through the normal X-ray conveyor, watching the screen populate with outlines. Wallet, keys, folded tissues, a paperback mystery novel, a thermos, and a pouch of medication. Nothing metal-based beyond the ordinary. No weapon, no knife, no explosive materials. Exactly as expected, Dylan said. Ranger lifted his head. That was enough of a sign. Dylan turned to the second machine, a compact matte black unit the size of a briefcase. This was his personal instrument, an advanced microfrequency scanner, not standard issue, not mass-produced, the kind of thing that came out of experimental labs and never made headlines. Margaret watched with curiosity. And that machine, what does it do? It finds things, Dylan replied, that don't want to be found. He placed the bag beneath its scanning arch, fingers flying with practiced speed across the touchscreen interface. Waves of faint blue light shimmered downward like ethereal curtains. The machine hummed in a faint, insect-like rhythm. Ethan watched Dylan at work, the concentration in his eyes, the way his brow furrowed, the subtle tightening of his jaw when he caught something unusual. Pause scan, Dylan murmured. The hum stopped. On the screen, a red dot blinked inside the outline of Margaret's tote bag. Of course, Dylan whispered, half in admiration, half in disdain. Right where a normal scanner wouldn't look. He zoomed in. The screen magnified a region of the bag lining, near the seam at the bottom, and there it was, a microchip smaller than a fingernail, low emission, non-metallic casing, nestled between layers of fabric, no explosive signature, no hazardous chemical reading, but emitting a very specific frequency. Margaret stared. That was in my bag? Yes, Dylan said gently, but you didn't put it there. Ranger let out a single quiet huff, an exhale of confirmation. Ethan bent closer to the screen. What frequency are we dealing with? RFID, Dylan answered. Low power, persistent. Looks like a tracker, not a signal transmitter. Ethan's mind moved through scenarios. A courier unknowingly transporting contraband? An elderly woman used as a mule without her knowledge? Or something more insidious, medical, psychological? He turned to Margaret, voice soft. Ms. Hayes, have you noticed anyone being unusually close to you recently? On the bus, perhaps? Or while you were shopping? Margaret thought, eyes narrowing with effort. 2 days ago, in the waiting room at the clinic, someone bumped into me while I was sitting down. A man, middle-aged, tall, wearing a scarf. He apologized, but I remember thinking he lingered a little too long, but I didn't think anything of it. Dylan muttered. Classic insertion opportunity. Ethan asked gently, Do you mind if we inspect the bag lining manually? Please, yes, do whatever you need to, Margaret said. Dylan used a small fabric safe cutter, carefully peeling back the sewn edge of the lining. Just an inch. There it was. Not metal, not shiny. A small matte polymer chip adhered to the fabric. Dylan removed it with tweezers, holding it up like a tiny artificial seed. That, he said, was broadcasting a frequency signature, very quiet, but Ranger picked it up. Margaret's eyes glistened. I was carrying something dangerous and didn't even know it? Not dangerous, Dylan corrected. But someone wanted to track this bag. Or track you. Ethan felt something inside him settle, a conviction that this was not random. Someone had turned an elderly woman into an unwitting carrier. Margaret's voice fell to a whisper. Was I used? Ethan looked her in the eyes and spoke with a sincerity that reached across the table like a hand of comfort. Yes, but not because you were weak, because you were invisible to them. They used the fact that no one would suspect you. That's not your fault. That's on them. Margaret's chin trembled slightly, but whether from anger or relief could not be said. Meanwhile, Dylan was already analyzing the chip. No explosive residue, no data storage, just an ID signature and a recycled frequency, meaning the important part isn't the chip itself, but what was receiving it. In other words, Ethan said, someone was watching. Dylan nodded. Or waiting. Ranger sat up, alert. Ethan exhaled slowly. This was no longer a simple bag check. It was an entry point. Ms. Hayes, Ethan said gently, we're going to need to have you evaluated by paramedics. Just routine. You've been carrying this device next to your medication and your thermos. We need to be certain there's no exposure effect. Margaret frowned. I feel fine, except for some stomach pains I've had recently. I thought it was just my age. As she spoke, Ranger's ears flicked, as though he recognized a truth beneath her words. Ethan exchanged a look with Dylan, one of those trained micro-glances that carried whole conversations. They would check her vitals. They would test the bag for chemical transfer. They would verify everything. And most importantly, they would follow the frequency back to its source. Ethan turned to Dylan. Send the chip data to Central. Have them look for matching signatures. Dylan nodded, already typing. And Dylan? Yeah? Good work. The technician blinked, not used to hearing that aloud, and his shy, lopsided smile appeared. Just doing my job, same as your furry partner here. Ranger thumped his tail once, as if acknowledging the compliment. Ethan put a hand on Ranger's shoulder, not a command, not a restraint, just shared grounding. The first thread of the web had been found. Now came the unraveling. Outside, the snow had become heavier, flakes now swarming like tiny white birds across the windows. The world beyond the glass looked wrapped in cotton, quiet, innocent. But inside this room, the truth had started to hum, just like the hidden chip, quiet, persistent, waiting to be seen. And now, it had. Because a dog smelled what machines could not. Because a technician saw what eyes ignored. Because an old woman asked for nothing except to be treated with dignity. Because Ethan Reed believed in gentle procedure over loud accusation. The morning had changed. None of them knew just how much yet, but the unseen frequency had been discovered, and nothing would be invisible anymore. The ambulance bay attached to St. Germain Hospital was bathed in a stark, almost sterile brightness, light reflecting off white snowbanks and icy pavement, creating a shimmering glare like seawater frozen in time. Ethan walked beside the gurney, carrying Margaret, while Ranger trotted quietly next to him, close enough to comfort, but not so close as to interfere. The cold wind carried a faint smell of diesel exhaust, disinfectant, and winter air, sharp and honest. Inside the hospital, the shift was immediate, fluorescent light instead of winter glow, quiet urgency replacing commuter chatter. Nurses in green scrubs moved with fluid efficiency. Doctors pushed rolling carts. Machines beeped in rhythmic patterns like coded messages. Ethan had been here many times, escorting victims, suspects, survivors, but this time felt different. This time, he felt responsible. Margaret Hayes looked smaller on the hospital bed, dwarfed by white sheets and sterile rails. Her knitted winter hat had been set aside, allowing wisps of silver hair to spill across her pillow like soft threads of snow. Yet, there was a spark in her eyes. Frightened, yes, but not defeated. She had lived too long to be crushed by the unknown. Still, her breathing came too shallow, and there was a slight tremble in her hands, as if her body knew something she didn't. Standing across from Ethan was Dr. Allison Penrose, a senior physician specializing in cardiovascular and internal diagnostics. She was in her early 40s, tall and striking, with auburn hair tied in a neat knot, and eyes of level, unflinching gray. Her presence carried authority, not by force or volume, but through steady clarity. A faint scar traced along her jawline, a leftover from a rock climbing accident years ago. The experience had cultivated in her a powerful patience. She never rushed when caution was wiser, never panicked when calm could save more lives. "All right," she said in a voice both crisp and warm. "I've looked at the initial vitals. Blood pressure elevated, heart rhythm mildly irregular, oxygen saturation slightly low. Nothing immediately catastrophic, but something is taxing her system." Margaret tried to joke, out of instinct more than confidence. "Could just be nerves. Not every day a dog thinks your purse is suspicious." Dr. Penrose smiled just enough to soften the mood. "The dog wasn't wrong, Ms. Hayes, but that doesn't make you guilty. It makes you unlucky." Ethan watched Margaret relax slightly at that. The right words mattered. The right tone mattered even more. Ranger sat by Ethan's boot, head lowered, ears swiveling, listening for emotional signals more than auditory ones. A nurse arrived with blood panels. Dr. Penrose scanned them, brow tightening. Elevated biomarkers, slight inflammatory response. And look at this, unusual trace compounds in her bloodstream. Ethan leaned in. Meaning what? Meaning something. Entered her system recently. Something synthetic. Margaret's eyes widened. Synthetic? Do you mean poison? No, Dr. Penrose replied quickly, gently. Not poison, more like subtle chemical exposure. Foreign material entering the bloodstream by proximity, perhaps through prolonged skin contact. Her gaze shifted to the tote bag sitting on the counter, now secured in a plastic contamination sleeve. "You said she carried this close to her body for days?" Ethan nodded. Against her side most of the time. Dr. Penrose's voice dropped to a quiet seriousness. "Then that's the likely vector." She turned to the paramedic who had transported Margaret. "Prep a cardiac exam. I want ECG, echocardiogram, and tissue chemical assay." Margaret swallowed. "Doctor, is it serious?" "Not fatal," Dr. Penrose assured her. "But you've had something building inside your system. We're going to help you before it becomes worse." A few minutes later, Margaret was moved into a private diagnostic room. Ethan and Ranger stood just outside the half-drawn curtain. Ranger sat patiently, but his eyes flicked from Ethan to the bed to the monitors, registering the quiet anxiety in the air. The cardiac ultrasound screen flickered to life. The rhythmic thump of Margaret's heart echoed through the speakers, a fragile percussion, wavering slightly in tempo. Dr. Penrose narrated as she examined. "Look at these small fluctuations, these microarrhythmias. They didn't just appear today. They're cumulative." She pointed at the tote bag through the glass. That bag had 4 layers of fabric between her and the embedded chip. Depending on its coating, chemicals may have diffused gradually through contact, enough to cause a delayed cardiovascular disturbance. Ethan reflected aloud. So, it wasn't designed to hurt her instantly, but slowly, subtly. Dr. Penrose nodded. "Yes, and that's often worse. It evades notice." Margaret's voice shook. "I thought it was just my age." Dr. Penrose squeezed her hand, doctor to patient, human to human. "Aging causes aches, stress causes pressure, but this was something else, and now we understand it." Margaret exhaled, relief mixed with fear. But then she looked at Ethan. "Will they find who did this?" Ethan nodded slowly. "We're already working on it." Ranger made a quiet sound, not a bark, more like an exhale of agreement. When the immediate medical tests finished, Ethan and Ranger stepped into the hallway while the staff tended to Margaret. Dr. Penrose joined them shortly after, removing her gloves. "She's going to be all right," she said, "but she'll need monitoring and treatment. The stress today amplified her symptoms. She was on the edge of cardiac strain." Ethan exhaled. "I'm grateful you caught it in time." Dr. Penrose's eyes softened. "You brought her here in time." Then she added, "Officer Reed, whoever placed that chip, did not care what they were doing to her body. Ethan's jaw tightened, and Ranger, sensing the shift in emotional current, straightened. Back in the patient room, Margaret lay with an IV drip connected. The quiet beeping of the monitors tracked the rhythm of her healing heart. Ethan stepped in. She looked up at him, and despite the exhaustion, she offered a small, genuine smile. "You didn't treat me like a criminal," she whispered. "I never thought you were one," Ethan replied. Ranger came close enough for her to rest her hand on his head. His fur was warm, like living velvet beneath her palm. "You saved me," she said to the dog. Ranger closed his eyes, accepting her gratitude with solemn dignity. Ethan stood nearby, not intruding, just present. And in Margaret's tired gaze, there was something new, not just relief, but gratitude and trust. Later, Ethan stepped into the hallway and made a quiet call to headquarters. His voice was low, measured. "We have probable cause to track the origin of the RFID frequency, and Dr. Penrose confirmed physiological effects from chemical exposure. This isn't random, and it isn't harmless." When he hung up, Ranger nudged his leg gently. Ethan looked down at his partner. "You were right, buddy. Something was wrong." Outside the hospital window, snowflakes drifted under street lamps, spiraling like white embers. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Margaret Hayes rested under warm blankets, safe now. But the question now hung in the air. If she was the unwitting carrier, who was the intended recipient? And what were they waiting for? The investigation was no longer just procedural, it was personal. For Ethan, for Ranger, and for Margaret, whose heart had carried more than just blood these past days. Snow thickened over Greystone like a closing curtain, and by the time Ethan and Ranger left St. Germain Hospital, the city had fallen into one of those winter silences where even the air seemed cautious. Their destination rose ahead on the far side of town, a wooded ridge known for old power stations and forgotten research facilities, flanked by bare trees etched against a white sky. The road up the incline was narrow, twisting through frost-bitten pines. Ranger sat upright in the back seat, gaze forward, ears pivoting with each change of road texture. Ethan drove steady, jaw set with quiet purpose. But he wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat Paul Havers, a veteran officer in his late 50s. Paul was broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with graying hair and lines on his face that looked carved by both laughter and sorrow. He had served through decades of shifting police policies and societal moods, and had developed a philosophy of calm realism. People called him Old Hawk, partly for his sharp vision, partly for his patience in waiting before striking. The loss of his wife 3 years prior, cancer, had softened him in unexpected ways. He became gentler with civilians, more attuned to vulnerability. With criminals, he became colder, almost eerily composed. Justice had become his ritual way of honoring loss. Behind Paul sat Dr. Evelyn Rhodes, their forensic medical specialist. She was in her mid-30s, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a loose bun and eyes the color of green ice. Evelyn had a quiet poise, soft-spoken but emotionally precise. Her background, raised by a nurse mother and a chemist father, she spent childhood weekends in laboratories and pharmacies, fascinated by how invisible substances could alter the body. During medical school, she suffered a period of personal burnout, even depression, after witnessing the death of a child under her care. Not due to error, but unavoidable medical tragedy. She recovered, but the event left her with a solemn empathy toward victims and a driven need to uncover truths hidden inside bodies. And at Ethan's other side sat Dylan Moore, the young technician who had found the chip. Dylan carried a tablet and a portable scanner unit. He seemed more comfortable around machines than people, though not out of rudeness, simply habit. He tapped at his device with quiet intensity as Ranger occasionally glanced at him with calm canine curiosity. Ethan said quietly as they ascended the hill, "We follow the chip frequency to its origin, but we assume nothing until we see it." Paul hummed in agreement. "Assumptions get officers killed, or worse, make victims of the wrong people." Evelyn nodded. "Whoever placed that chip didn't anticipate long-term health effects, or didn't care. Either option is disturbing." Ranger gave a soft, low vocalization, barely audible. Paul smirked. "Dog agrees." Dylan spoke next, eyes still locked to the tablet. The chip was broadcasting a signal signature every 90 seconds. Not an audio signal, a silent numeric pulse. Something was receiving it. Then he added, "And the reception point is right up ahead." A chill deeper than winter touched the group. They reached a clearing where an old building stood, a squat, concrete facility half buried in snowdrifts. The outside bore weathered signage faded by time. The structure looked like a relic from a past era of state research, abandoned and unseen by most citizens, but not unused. Lights flickered behind shuttered windows. Ethan parked the SUV beside a copse of frozen bushes. They stepped out into the sharp cold, exhalations forming clouds of steam. Ranger leapt down, landing silently on the icy ground, posture alert and nose raised. Paul adjusted his thick coat. "We go in quiet, we go in cautious." Ethan nodded. "Dylan, what are we looking at?" Dylan scanned the building perimeter with his device. Multiple heat signatures, 3 human, possibly 4, and a distinct electronics cluster, definitely a server bay or hardware rack. Evelyn zipped up her coat. "Any chance the emitters are still active?" "Oh," Dylan replied. "They're active. The receivers are pinging every time Ranger's chip signal cross threshold." Meaning, Ethan finished softly. "This was planned." They approached the entry. Ranger walked at Ethan's side, not pulling ahead, just vibrating with attention. At the door, Ethan knocked firmly, using the department's standard knock and announce cadence. "Greystone Police Department. We need to speak with whoever is in charge." Silence for a moment, then the door opened. Standing there was Dr. Stanley Crow. Crow was a man in his early 60s, tall, with pale hair swept back, and spectacles perched loosely on a sharp nose. His build was lean, almost academic, and his faded lab coat hung like a memory rather than a tire. There was something weary in his face, not malevolence, more like a person who had carried a burden too long. The pupils of his eyes flickered with a restless kind of intelligence, like someone who still believed in a mission even as that mission lost clarity. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I expected someone would come eventually." Ethan kept his tone mild. "I'm Officer Ethan Reed. We're here regarding an RFID chip placed in a civilian's bag, a Mrs. Margaret Hayes. We've traced it to this facility." Crow inhaled slowly. "Hayes? Yes. The carrier." Evelyn stepped forward, voice controlled but edged. "She is not a carrier. She is a person who was unknowingly exposed to your work." Crow didn't bristle. Instead, he looked genuinely troubled. "She wasn't meant to be harmed. The dosage was supposed to be contained. I miscalculated." Paul spoke then, voice like gravel. Not the best choice of words. Crow gestured inward. "Come in. I won't resist. I'll show you everything." There was a moment of tension. Is this a trap? Then Ranger stepped past the threshold, nose sweeping, muscles steady. Ethan trusted the dog's instinct. He followed. Inside was an operational research facility. Rows of equipment, data screens, chemical analysis kits, frequency receivers mounted on panels. 2 assistants were present. 1 woman, 1 man, both in their 30s. They wore lab gear and both had a quiet, haunted look, as though they were trapped between belief and doubt. Dylan's scanner beeped quietly. "Those are the receivers, 3 of them. Each one logged signals from Hayes' bag." Crow nodded. "Yes, I tagged selected individuals who fit criteria: low suspicion profile, high exposure mobility, predictable travel habits." Ethan's voice sharpened a degree. "And you didn't consider human cost?" Crow looked downward. "After my time in the military, after watching patients die waiting for proper organ diagnostics, I became convinced surveillance and biomonitoring could prevent suffering. The chip was meant to track biological markers of environmental toxin exposure, not to harm." Evelyn pressed. "And what is your motive now? Still saving the world? Or covering your tracks?" Crow closed his eyes. "I thought I was helping, but somewhere along the way, I lost perspective." There was silence. Then it happened. A faint hum from a corner. a device activating. Crow turned sharply. "No! Wait!" He lunged toward it, but it wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a detonator. It was a data purge system. Crow slapped his hand against it, attempting trigger, but Ranger was faster. The dog leapt, silent, controlled, not attacking, but intercepting. His body collided with Crow in a steady shove, forcing the man sideways. Crow stumbled and fell, hitting the floor, disoriented. The device clicked, but the signal was misaligned. The purge command didn't reach the servers. Ethan moved in instantly, securing Crow's wrist in a submission hold. Not brutal, just decisive. Paul cut power to the device. Dylan isolated the network. Evelyn checked Crow's airway, purely medical habit. Ranger stood guard, posture neutral but unyielding. Crow lay gasping, not from pain, from shock. I wasn't trying to destroy lives. I just couldn't let the work be misunderstood," Ethan said quietly. "Then don't destroy the data. Help us. Tell the truth." The assistant stood frozen, uncertain. Then the woman stepped forward. "We'll cooperate. We tried to talk him out of the insertion program weeks ago. He wouldn't stop." Crow shut his eyes, as if surrendering. At last. Ethan eased his grip, but didn't release fully. "You're done running this your way. Now you're going to do it the right way." Crow nodded. On. Outside again, the snow had stopped. A stillness hung over the ridge. Inside the SUV, Crow sat handcuffed, not violently restrained, but matter of fact. His expression was hollow, but oddly relieved. Evelyn stared out the window, thinking of Margaret's frail hands. Paul wrote the initial incident report. Dylan typed, extracted data logs. Ranger rested, head tilted against Ethan's arm, listening, calm. Ethan took a slow breath. This wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about repairing a broken intention, turning a twisted effort back toward humanity. And for the first time in years, Crow whispered, maybe this will finally make something right." Back at the Greystone Forensic Operations Wing, a secure building tucked behind City Hall and shielded by reinforced glass, Ethan, Ranger, and the team stepped into the analytic war room, where evidence came not to be hidden, but illuminated. The air inside was cool and still, humming with the whisper of ventilation systems. Screens glowed on the walls, each displaying streams of preserved data extracted from Crow's facility. They had stopped the purge. But what now? Dr. Stanley Crow sat at the far end of the room under observation, not in a barred cell, but in a restrained chair with his wrists cuffed and a thermal blanket around his shoulders. He looked tired, not from struggle, but from surrender. Paul Havers leaned against the adjacent wall, arms crossed, watching the old scientist with the weary patience of a man who had known too many faces of regret. Ethan stood by the main workstation with Dylan, who was now fully in his element. His fingers tapped rapidly across the keyboard, pulling up waveforms, timestamps, and signal trajectories. Ranger lay by Ethan's feet, calm, eyes half-lidded, but every muscle ready for the slightest cue. "We're inside the logs," Dylan announced. "Pre-purge state, all packet transmissions intact." Paul muttered, "English, kid." Dylan half smiled, then translated simply, "We have everything. He didn't erase anything." Evelyn Rhodes joined them, arms folded. Her clinical gaze skimmed the data, trying to read its implications not with electronics, but with human cost. "Crow," Ethan said, turning toward the older man, "the more transparent you are now, the better this goes, for everyone, including you." Crow's voice emerged low, gravelly. "I'm not your enemy, Officer Reed, though I suspect I've been my own." Ethan didn't respond with sympathy or scorn, just quiet expectation. Crow nodded slowly. "I'll tell you the rest." He straightened, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. "The chip wasn't meant to harm. I developed it to monitor biosignatures, cortisol, toxin exposure, microvascular changes. I wanted early detection of heart conditions, strokes, circulatory failures." Evelyn spoke gently but firmly. "But you bypassed consent. You used unwitting subjects. Even if your intent was clinical, the execution was unethical." Crow winced. Yes, I see that now." Paul stepped closer. Intent stops mattering when real people get sick. Crow looked up, haunted. Do you think I wanted to hurt her? I saw what untreated illnesses did to soldiers, and patients, and friends. I thought if I had data, I could save lives faster than bureaucracy. He trailed off. Then something shifted, no longer defending. Now, confessing. At Dylan's workstation, a signal alert chimed. 3 short tones. Dylan froze. Incoming ping? Ethan leaned in. From where? Dylan's fingers danced. Not from Crow's facility. That was shut down. This is coming from a remote receiver node. Evelyn frowned. Meaning there are other receiving stations? Yes, Dylan breathed, which means the network is bigger. Ethan turned back to Crow sharply. How many receivers are there? Crow's voice was small. 5. I built 5. I only shut down the 1. The others are automated. Dylan's eyes widened. Automated, meaning if they detect interference, Ethan finished the sentence. They attempt backup erasure automatically. Paul swore under his breath. Ethan moved quickly. Dylan, isolate the incoming signal. Trying. The console flashed red. Remote delete attempt. Active. Paul barked. Shut it down! I can't. It's not coming here. It's broadcasting. Ranger stiffened, ears snapping upward. Ethan followed instinct and canine reaction. Everyone stepped back. Ranger rose, moved to the center of the room. Posture forward, sensing something. Not sound, not smell. Something electrical. The ozone signature of overheating hardware. Dylan shouted, One of the data racks is overheating. It's forcing thermal destruction. Ethan rushed to the server enclosure, Ranger at his side, and saw thin tendrils of smoke rising from inside the temperature-sealed glass case. Crow stood up, pale. The system is burning the drives. It's designed to destroy data by heat. Ethan cut him off. How do we stop it? Crow squeezed his eyes shut, thinking, memory firing. There's an override. He pointed weakly. On the back of the main circuit, a small blue toggle. Paul was already moving, Ethan beside him, but Ranger reached it first, nose pressed to the glass. Ethan pulled the door open, heat washed out, acrid, bitter. Ranger didn't hesitate. He thrust himself in, not to bite, but to reach behind the active wiring with his muzzle with a precision born not of instinct, but of training. His teeth didn't clamp, they pressed. The switch flicked with a sharp audible snap. The smoke ceased. The thermal cascade shut down. Temperature dropped. The server fans whirred back to life. And just like that, the silent disaster dissipated. Ethan pulled Ranger out, patting him firmly. You brilliant dog. Paul let out a grunt of relieved laughter. That mutt just saved our entire digital evidence chain. Dylan was pale from stress, then grinned weakly. That wasn't luck. He smelled circuit burn before I even saw the alert. Crow stared, stunned. He saved it? Ethan turned to him, voice steady. He saved your work so that it can be used for justice, not buried. Crow's expression crumpled. Tears gathered. Not dramatic, simply human. You don't know what it means to not be erased. Evelyn's voice was soft now. You will still face consequences, Dr. Crow, but because you're helping, less will be taken from you than if you kept fighting us. Crow nodded silently, a man who finally understood that his redemption, however incomplete, required cooperation. Hours passed, data was archived, receiver nodes were mapped, legal process initiated. Ranger slept lightly under the table, paws twitching in dream motions. Paul drank bitter black coffee in silence. Dylan hovered over holographic output. Evelyn updated patient notes. Ethan filed the formal incident draft. Eventually, Crow looked at Ethan with an exhausted honesty. Please, tell Mrs. Hayes, I never meant to endanger her. Ethan considered, then nodded once. I will. But know this, safety doesn't just come from knowledge, it comes from accountability. Crow lowered his gaze. Yes, I'm learning that now. Outside the operations building, dawn began tinting the snow with pale gold. The night had been long, the danger had been real, but the disaster, the true irreversible disaster, had been stopped not with violence, but with a sensor nose and a gentle push from a dog who understood urgency. Ranger climbed into the SUV beside Ethan, leaning into his side. The city exhaled, as if relieved, and Ethan whispered into the quiet, "We're almost through this, boy. One more chapter, and justice will settle." Snow fell in softer flakes the following morning, not like knives, but like feathers, as Greystone began to stir beneath a pale winter sunrise. The crisis had passed its most dangerous point. Now came the part that was quieter, but in many ways harder, reckoning, healing, and setting things right with those most affected. Ethan parked outside St. Germain Hospital once more, Ranger hopping out beside him and landing in the snow with a gentle whump. The building's glass doors opened automatically, releasing a breath of warm, sterile air into the morning chill. Ethan carried no weapons drawn, no urgency in his stride, just the calm weight of purpose. Inside, Margaret Hayes sat propped up against her pillows in a small private recovery room, with a window view of frost-glazed tree branches. Her skin had more color today, though her hands were still pale. Her eyes, though weary, held a spark that hadn't been there before, the spark of someone who had survived a storm she never chose to enter. Beside her sat a new character, Nurse Clara Simmons, a secondary figure in this story, but a presence of gentle importance. Clara was in her late 20s, freckled, with curly red hair tied back haphazardly and a tendency toward cheerful chatter. She was known in the ward for treating elderly patients like cherished relatives instead of medical numbers. Clara had lost her grandmother 3 years earlier and had sworn quietly on the day of that funeral to become the kind of caretaker her grandmother had deserved. She looked up as Ethan entered. "Good timing," Clara said softly. "She's been asking when you'd come back." Margaret smiled. "I wasn't sure you actually would. I half expected you would just move on to other cases." Ethan shook his head. "I don't move on from people, especially not those hurt by something they never chose." Margaret's gaze drifted down to Ranger, who stepped forward and rested his chin on the edge of her bed. She stroked his head with slow tenderness. "Good boy," she whispered. "You were the first guardian of this whole thing, weren't you?" Ranger breathed calmly, tail brushing against the floor like a slow metronome of reassurance. Ethan pulled up a chair and sat. "There's something I want you to hear directly. Dr. Crow confessed his involvement and is cooperating. He gave us names, locations, and remaining equipment. We dismantled it all." Margaret exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to lighten her ribs. "So it's over?" "Yes," Ethan said. "For you, it's over." She grew quiet. Then, "Will he go to prison?" Ethan nodded slightly. "Yes, but because he cooperated, his sentence will be reduced. He won't be locked away forever." A small frown creased Margaret's brow, then she softened. "He did wrong, but I don't hate him. I'm just grateful the truth came out." Ethan nodded slowly. "He asked me to tell you something." Margaret blinked. "Oh?" Ethan met her eyes. "He said he never meant to hurt you. He said your life mattered more than the data." Margaret's eyes glistened. She placed a wrinkled hand over her heart. "Thank you for telling me. I forgive him." There was silence, warm, gentle silence, as if even the machines paused their beeping for a heartbeat. Later that day, Ethan made his way to the Greystone Municipal Court wing, where a closed preliminary hearing was taking place. Not a public circus, but a private legal proceeding required for formal charges and bail assignment. Present were Stanley Crow, thinner, humbled; Paul Havers, steady, ready to testify; Dylan Moore, with his equipment logs and signal data; Dr. Evelyn Rhodes, with medical findings demonstrating the physical impact on Margaret. Crow sat still, wrists no longer cuffed, but resting passively in his lap. When he looked up at Ethan across the table, there was no defensiveness, only acknowledgement. The judge, Harold Beckett, a calm man in his 60s with silver hair and a soft, introspective manner, reviewed the findings. Judge Beckett was known not for harshness nor indulgence, but for measured justice. He had a history of restoring punitive balance with humane reasoning. He himself had lost a son to an undiagnosed heart condition 20 years ago, a tragedy that shaped his judicial view of both medical responsibility and scientific ambition. After reviewing the evidence, Judge Beckett spoke, "Dr. Crow, you violated ethical and legal boundaries, but you have cooperated fully. You prevented escalation of harm, and you preserved, rather than concealed, truth. The court will honor that cooperation." Crow closed his eyes. He would not escape consequences, but he would not be treated as a monster. He would be treated as a flawed human being who made wrong choices while aiming at something he believed was good. The next key moment came later that evening, in a modest office lit by a single desk lamp. Ethan sat across from Crow alone, not as interrogator and subject, but as two men dealing with aftermath. "You could have made different choices," Ethan said, "but you didn't keep doubling down. That matters." Crow's voice was rough. "I spent years believing that ends justify means. Today, I finally saw that they don't." Ethan nodded. "You'll serve time, but you'll come out with a chance to do things the right way." Crow exhaled, almost relief. "I hope so." Then Ranger, who had been lying silently in the corner, got up and approached Crow. He sat beside him. Crow hesitated, then gently touched the dog's head. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't redemption in full, but it was something. A beginning. 3 weeks later, the snow had melted into gentle patches where grass pushed through, like the city was relearning to breathe again. Outside Margaret's apartment, Ethan and Ranger paid one final visit. Margaret had regained strength. She walked with a cane, but her steps were confident. She had baked ginger cookies. Clara the nurse sometimes still checked on her after shifts, just because care didn't always end with duty. Margaret hugged Ethan. "You treated me with dignity. That's something I won't forget." Then she knelt, carefully, and placed both hands on Ranger's thick fur. "And you saved me before I even knew I needed saving." Ranger leaned into her touch, eyes soft, posture relaxed. Then she quoted something her late husband once said, "Sometimes angels have 4 legs." Ethan smiled. "And sometimes justice arrives not with punishment, but with restoration." Margaret stood in the doorway as they left, watching them fade into the evening. Winter was ending. So was the fear. And in that quiet, Greystone felt like a place where things could begin anew, where even broken intentions could be reshaped, where harm could be acknowledged, where healing could occur, and where one dog's small instincts could save something much larger than data. He saved trust. In the quiet closing of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come through the loyalty of a dog who refuses to give up, through the compassion of an officer who chooses dignity over suspicion, and through the healing of a heart that was unknowingly burdened. In our everyday lives, we face storms of our own moments of fear, doubt, or loneliness. But God walks beside us even then. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we often recognize only afterward. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment below to tell us your thoughts and type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles God sends. And please support the channel by subscribing so we can continue bringing stories of faith, hope, and love. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength.